My name is Elias, and it took me 35 years to understand that an inheritance is not always a gift. Sometimes it is a life sentence. When the lawyer pushed that heavy brass key across his desk and said my great-uncle had left this rural property for me, I thought I was going to experience the smell of rain-soaked earth and burnt firewood, not the smell of decaying flesh. The road leading to the house twisted like a dark snake between dense trees, and when I reached the destination, the building towered before my eyes. Not like an abandoned structure, but like someone who had been waiting for years to embrace someone again. The first thing that made me feel uneasy were the windows. Instead of reflecting the sunlight, the glass seemed to swallow the light. When I entered, there was no dust on the floor. A house that had been empty for 10 years should have been buried under a layer of dust, but here everything was shiny, as if someone had just cleaned it with obsession moments ago. On the first night, as I sat on the couch in the heavy silence of the living room, I noticed that the ticking sound of a clock was coming from somewhere where there was no clock at all. The sound was from inside the wall. I told myself it must be plumbing, but pipes shouldn't have a pulse like the heart of a living creature. When I placed my hand on the wallpaper, I jumped back in terror. The wall shivered under my skin. Not a vibration caused by wind or an earthquake, but a soft, warm tremor, exactly like when you put your hand on the chest of a sleeping dog. That same night, when I wanted to leave the kitchen, I saw that the door's position had changed. The door that opened to the hallway now opened to a dead-end wall. I was trapped. The house had begun to speak, not with words, but by moving its rooms. The bedroom where I had placed my belongings was now at the end of a narrow, damp hallway that didn't exist in the house's floor plan at all. I tried my best to stay calm, but when the hall floor started to sweat, I realized what I was dealing with. A sticky, salty liquid was oozing from between the wood joints, bearing a strange resemblance to human cold sweat. The air became intensely hot, a suffocating heat that seemed to come from the breaths of a large being. My whole body began to itch. I felt as if thousands of small eyes were watching me from behind the carpet fibers. It was 2 a.m. when I realized that this house had chosen me to stay alive. The next morning, when I opened the door a crack to escape, I saw an old woman standing in the garden by the hedge, working on dead flowers with pruning shears. She didn't even lift her head to see me. She just muttered under her breath that he has become hungry again, and you should not resist much, because the more you struggle, the more the house squeezes you. I asked, "Where is my uncle?" The old woman paused, tilted her head, and pointed to a direction where the house walls seemed thicker. She said, "Your uncle is now part of the pillars of this house. He is now holding the roof over your head." A shiver ran through my body. I looked at the wooden pillars of the living room. The lines on the wood no longer looked like tree knots. They looked like the facial lines of a man who was screaming. The house was no longer a place. It was a living creature that was digesting me within itself. Every time I tried to go toward the exit door, the hallway became longer, as if the house were stretching like a piece of rubber to keep me away from freedom. I am Elias, and now I know that these walls have memory. They have stored within themselves all the pains of those who were here before me. Tonight, when the ground pulsed again and its heat rose from the soles of my feet, I felt my bones becoming soft, as if the house wanted to mold me into one of its own furnishings. I hear the sound of something being digested in the basement, a sound like the gnawing of bone. I must find a way before my skin becomes one with the wallpapers of this room. Strange sounds are heard from behind the bedroom walls, sounds that bear no resemblance to mice or the settling of the building. It's as if someone with long fingernails is softly scratching the inner layer of plaster to find a way out. This morning when I woke up, I noticed that my bed had moved several meters away from the window, whereas I had placed it exactly next to the window frame last night. "Elias, you are going crazy." This was the sentence I kept repeating in my mind. But the red stains that had appeared on the bedsheets screamed a different truth. The stains had no specific pattern, as if the house had wept blood on me from the ceiling vents during the night. As I put my foot on the floor, I instinctively pulled back from the intense heat. The floor of the room felt like a body with a high fever, hot and moist. Walking on these woods no longer felt like walking on a hard surface. The ground sank slightly under my footsteps, just as if I were walking on meat. I went to the bathroom to wash my face, but when I turned on the tap, instead of water, hot and foul-smelling air escaped with pressure, smelling of carrion. The house was panting. It was as if my efforts to open the locked doors throughout the night had exhausted it. My gaze fell on the mirror. My image in the mirror had a strange vibration, not because of the quality of the glass, but because the wall behind me was constantly contracting and expanding. In the mirror's reflection, I saw that the hallway behind me, which until a few moments ago was dark and empty, was now filled with shadows squirming between the cracks of the walls. I turned around, but there was nothing. Only the wallpapers, which seemed to have grown darker in color. The purple flowers on the wallpaper now looked like bruises on a human body. I decided to find a way out by any means possible. I went to the living room window and threw the heavy oak chair at the glass with all my strength. The chair hit the glass, but the sound that rose was not the sound of breaking glass. It was a sound like stone hitting a thick, tough piece of meat. The glass didn't even crack, it just dented slightly and returned to its original state. The windows were no longer windows. They had turned into transparent and impenetrable skins. At that moment, a whisper rose from the basement, a voice that called my name. Elias, Elias, come down, it is cooler here. The voice was so intimate and familiar that for a moment I thought it was my father, but my father had died years ago. I knew this was a deception. The house was feeding on my memories to pull me to the lower floors, where the pulsations were stronger. Suddenly, I noticed that in the middle of the living room, a small wooden hatch had appeared that wasn't there before. From the cracks of the hatch, a green and putrid light seeped out. I didn't want to go, but it felt as if the slope of the room floor was changing. The house had tilted itself to roll me toward that hatch. The more I clawed at the walls, the more my hands sank into the soft texture of the wall. The walls had become sticky like honey, and seemed to want to swallow my hands. My foot caught on the edge of the hatch, and in an instant, I lost my balance. As I fell into the darkness, I felt thousands of small, cold hands touching my body. They didn't want to hurt me. They just wanted to touch me, as if they were encountering a piece of fresh meat after centuries. When I reached the basement floor, the atmosphere was completely different. Here the walls no longer had any covering. The pillars were made of large bones tied together with nerve fibers. This was the heart of the house. In the center of the basement, I saw a creature trapped in a mass of flesh and wood. He was still alive, but half of his face had become one with the wall. He looked at me, and with the only eye remaining for him, shed a tear of blood. He was not my uncle. He was someone else, perhaps the same previous owner the lawyer said had gone on a trip. He said with a trembling voice, "Don't run, Elias. The more you run, the thirstier the house becomes. It needs your blood to keep its roof steady." I looked at my feet in horror and saw thin, red-colored roots emerging from between the floorboards, slowly wrapping around my ankles. They didn't hurt. They just gave a strange cooling sensation, as if they were injecting morphine into my veins so I wouldn't feel the pain. The house was numbing me to swallow me more easily. I had to find a way. I swung my flashlight all around the basement, and in a corner, I saw an old toolbox that was half buried. Amidst all that horror, a rusty axe was my only hope. But when I reached my hand toward the axe, the basement shook and a loud groan rose from the depths of the earth. The house had realized I intended to harm it. The walls began to secrete an acid that smelled of ammonia. Thick smoke filled the space and stung my eyes. "Elias, if you don't get up now, you will become part of this foundation forever." I pulled the axe out from the sticky textures of the ground. Its handle was cold, but the vibration coming from the depths of the house was transmitted through the rusty wood to the bones of my hand. The house was no longer being secretive. "Elias," I realized this when the bone pillar in the center of the basement turned slightly with a sound like a joint cracking, opening a new hallway in front of me. I didn't want to enter it, but there was no way back. The hatch I had fallen through was now completely closed, like a wound that heals. The walls of this hallway were damp, and when I shone the flashlight on them, I could see blue, bulging veins pulsing with a fast rhythm. The smell of sour milk had now been replaced by the thick smell of iron and chemicals. The hallway grew shorter with every step I took. The ceiling was slowly lowering, as if the house were closing its mouth to swallow me. I was forced to walk hunched over. It was a terrible feeling. The feeling of the stone, cold ceiling constantly brushing against the hair on my head. At the end of the hallway, I reached a room that had no door. In the center of the room was an old surgical table, but instead of metal, it was made of something resembling cartilage. On the table, my clothes were laid out, the same clothes I had left in my suitcase upstairs. The house had not only moved my things, but had arranged them exactly as if it were waiting for my return to a new body. On the opposite wall, written with a thick black liquid, it said, "New parts for eternal masonry. Elias." It was at that moment I understood why the neighbors said this house changes its owner. The house didn't want an owner. The house wanted spare parts. When one of the pillars rotted, or when one of the door's hinges failed, the house invited a new person to the inheritance to replace the pillar with their bones and the wallpaper with their skin. My uncle hadn't died. He had just become structure. Suddenly, a loud thumping sound rose from under the surgical table. The ground opened its mouth and a mass of flesh and muscle that bore a distant resemblance to a human face emerged. It had no eyes, but its mouth opened, and with a voice that seemed to come from the throat of a wounded animal, it whispered, "Elias, it hurts so much. Let it end." It wanted the axe. It wanted me to end this agony. But when I raised the axe, the house showed a violent reaction. The walls began to shake, and from between the cracks, hundreds of hair-like, red roots lashed out. They struck at me like whips. One of them wrapped around my hand and wrenched the axe from my grip. The pain was like an acid burn. I felt something entering my skin, something that wanted to become one with my blood. "Elias," I screamed, but the voice was choked in my throat. The house was feeling my larynx. It was learning the frequency of my voice so that later it could lure others here with my voice. With misery, I pulled myself back and leaned against a wall, but the wall softened and, like a giant embrace, pulled me into itself. Half of my body was submerged in the wall. I felt the plaster and brick merging with the tissues of my back. At that moment, strange images flashed in my mind. I saw the memories of people who had been here before. A woman who had been lost here in the 19th century and was now part of the fireplace. A man who had taken refuge here during the war years, and now water pipes passed through his ribs. The house was a living museum of human pains. I was becoming part of this archive. With every pulse, I felt my memory being erased. I whispered my name, "Elias, Elias," but the house whispered back in response, "Brick, pillar, roof." It was redefining my identity. In the height of despair, I noticed my flashlight was shaking on the floor. Its light fell on a gap under the surgical table, a place that seemed to be an emergency exit or perhaps an old ventilation hatch. With all my strength, I pulled out my fingers that were becoming one with the wall. My skin peeled off and stayed on the wall, but I didn't care. I crawled toward that gap. The house gave a loud moan, as if a tooth had been pulled without anesthesia. The ground under my feet opened its mouth to swallow me, but I threw myself into that narrow duct. That duct smelled of burnt oil and dampness. It was cold, unlike the rest of the house, which was feverish. As I crawled in the darkness, I felt the walls of the duct contracting. The house was trying to crush me, like an intestine trying to expel waste. But I kept going. "Elias, you are not finished yet." A weak light appeared at the end of the duct. When I came out, I found myself in the backyard. It was raining, and the coldness of the raindrops on my skin was like a miracle. But when I turned and looked at the house, I saw that the building no longer had its usual shape. The house was slowly changing its form under the moonlight. The walls were swirling like dough, and the windows were constantly opening and closing, as if the house were panting with rage at losing its morsel. But what sent a shiver through my body was the shadow of the old woman standing on the second-floor balcony. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the forest. She raised her hand and pointed her finger at me. Not at me, but at the ground under my feet. I looked and saw that the grass under my feet was turning red. The ground was getting hot. The house wasn't just that building. This territory, this soil, were all part of it. I had come out of the building, but I was still in its stomach. My feet slipped on the wet grass. Elias, you are still in the trap. This was the voice coming from the depths of the earth beneath my feet. The house stood watching me in heavy silence, but the yard was no longer that open and free space it used to be. The weeping willow trees that surrounded the area now stretched their branches toward me like long, knotted fingers. There was no wind, but the leaves moved with a sound like whispering. The ground under my feet had become so hot I felt steam rising from between my toes. I tried to run toward the fences, but the more I ran, the farther the fences seemed. Space was expanding. This was one of the abilities of this territory. It could change distances to trap you in an eternal run. Suddenly, I felt something grab my ankle. I looked and saw that the roots of the willow tree had come out from under the soil like the arms of an octopus and wrapped around my leg. They were neither woody nor cold. They had a soft, warm texture, exactly like blood vessels. With bare hands, I tried to untie the roots from my leg, but they sank into my skin. Elias, the pain went through the bone. While I was struggling, I saw that the old woman had vanished from the balcony and was now standing a few meters away from me, next to the old water. Well, she showed no reaction to my struggles. She just pulled a heavy metal bucket up from the well. When the bucket reached the edge of the well, she emptied its contents onto the ground. From the bucket, a thick, dark liquid poured out that was neither water nor oil. It was something like digestive acid that immediately burned the green grass and turned it black. The old woman said with a voice that seemed to pass through pebbles, "The soil is thirsty, Elias. It doesn't want the blood of the building. It wants the flesh of the homeowner." She came toward me. Her face under the moonlight was like a cracked leather mask. She continued, "You thought you escaped the house? The house is just an organ. This land, this soil, is the main heart here. The house is just a cage that softens the flesh for the land." The roots were pulling me toward the well. The well had opened its mouth and the stench of long years emanated from it. "Elias," I tried my best to find something to cling to. My hand hit the edge of a stone that bore a strange resemblance to a step. With all my strength, I pulled myself toward it. The roots moaned against my resistance. Yes, the roots had a voice. A sound like rubber being dragged on asphalt. Suddenly the ground under my feet shook and a deep crack opened its mouth. From inside the crack, a purple, flickering light emerged. I was on the edge of another fall. The old woman reached me. She stretched out her hand, but not to help. She wanted to push me into the crack. But at that moment, I noticed something. On the old woman's wrist, I saw the same birthmark I had seen in old family photos on my aunt's hand. The aunt who had disappeared 20 years ago. She wasn't an old woman. She was part of the digested history of this house, reconstructed as a guardian. I shouted, "Aunt." She paused for a moment. Her dull eyes trembled, and for a second, just 1 second, a flame of human intelligence flickered in her gaze. She whispered, "Elias, run, go toward the burnt root." She pointed toward a large willow tree, half of which had turned black from a lightning strike years ago. The house, seemingly enraged by this betrayal of its guardian, began to shake. The building's walls gave a loud groan, and suddenly all the windows shattered simultaneously. Shards of glass were launched toward us like arrows. The old woman threw herself on top of me to protect me. I felt how cold and hard her body was, as if made of plaster. She was being crushed under the glass strikes, but she didn't move. I crawled out from under her collapsing body and ran toward the burnt willow tree. The ground under my feet rose and fell like ocean waves. The house was trying to prevent me from reaching the tree by creating heights and hollows. Every step I took, the soil wrapped around my feet like sticky mud. But Elias, you must not stop. I reached the burnt tree. Unlike the others, the roots of this tree were cold and dead. It seemed this was the only spot in this territory where the land had no life force. As soon as I touched the burnt trunk of the tree, the earth's shaking stopped. The house stood a few meters away from me, watching me with those dark openings of its windows. It could no longer reach this spot. But the old woman, or what was left of my aunt, had now completely become one with the soil. She no longer existed. I was alone, in the middle of a yard that could come alive again at any moment. My gaze fell under my feet. Amidst the burnt roots of the tree, I saw an old iron door hidden under a layer of charcoal and soil. This wasn't a hallway to the outside of the property. This was a path to below the foundation, where perhaps the secret to killing this creature lay. Whispering sounds began again, but this time louder and harsher. The house was contracting itself to swallow the whole yard with one leap. Elias, you had to choose. Either escape in a land that has no end, or enter the depths of darkness to cut the pulse of this monster. I put my hand on the iron handle. It was ice. As soon as I turned the handle, the entire structure of the house shook, as if I had touched its sensitive nerve. I turned the iron handle with all my might. The sound of the rusty hinges was like the scream of a woman being choked in her throat. As soon as the door opened, the smell of stale air and cold ash hit my face. A smell that was at least better than the putrid smell of meat inside the house. Stone and slippery steps led downward, to a place that seemed to be the root of all these nightmares. Elias, you were stepping into the heart of darkness. Behind me, the house gave a thunderous jolt. I felt the building's walls dragging themselves on the ground to reach this point. They were afraid of this iron door. The steps ended, and I reached a space that didn't resemble ordinary basements. Here the walls were made of massive natural stones bound together with thick, rusty chains. On the stones, patterns were carved that seemed to belong to centuries ago, images of people praying around a large pit. In the center of this cave-like space was the thing the main pulse came from, a large, gray mass that looked like a giant cocoon. This cocoon emitted a dull, purplish light with every heartbeat. All around the cocoon, hundreds of thin tubes made of human and plant tissues were connected to the ceiling. Now I understood. The house was just a shell this creature had built for itself. This cocoon was feeding on the life and souls of people so that one day it would open. Elias, you were just a food source, a fleshy battery for a creature that hasn't been born yet. I went forward. The floor of this space was covered with crushed bones and rotted clothes. An old watch, a broken pair of glasses, and a wedding ring still remaining on the bones of a finger. These were the remains of those who had become owners of the house before me. Suddenly, the cocoon trembled. A crack appeared on its surface, and a sticky, dark liquid leaked out. A voice echoed in my head, not from my ears, but directly in the center of my brain. The voice said, Elias, you are different. You smell of the old blood. An intense pain throbbed in my temples. Images of ancestors passed before my eyes like a high-speed movie. I saw how this land, generation after generation, had deceived my family. This inheritance was not an accident. My family had made a pact with this creature centuries ago. They gave flesh and blood, and in return, the land gave them wealth and power. My uncle was the last victim who had failed to pay his share, and now it was my turn. I gripped the rusty axe, which I still had in my hand, more tightly. Elias, if you destroy this cocoon, maybe everything will end. But as soon as I took a step forward, the chains on the walls began to rattle. They lunged toward me like iron snakes. One of the chains wrapped around my waist and threw me with force against the stone wall. I lost my breath. I felt my ribs crushing under the pressure of the black iron. The cocoon pulsed again. This time its purple light was so intense it lit up the entire space. Amidst that light, I saw the tubes connected to the ceiling begin to move. They were coming toward me like hungry worms. One of them reached my skin and placed its suction mouth on my arm. I felt something being sucked out from within me. Not just blood, but my memories. The memory of the first day of school, my mother's face, the taste of the first coffee I had in my old apartment. Everything was going toward that cocoon. The house upstairs was shaking crazily. I could hear the ceiling collapsing. The monster was using all its power to bury me in this basement. Elias, you must not let it take your memories. With the hand that was still free, I took out the small knife I had in my pocket and cut the suction tube. A foul-smelling black liquid splashed on my face. The chain around my waist loosened slightly. I took the opportunity and freed myself. I raised the axe and ran toward the cocoon. With all the hatred I had for this house and this inheritance, I drove the axe into the pulsing center of the cocoon. The sound that rose was not the sound of metal hitting tissue, but a thousand-voiced scream. It was as if thousands of people screamed simultaneously under the earth. The cocoon split open and a flood of that dark liquid poured out. But what was inside the cocoon was not a heart or a brain. Inside the cocoon, I saw a young boy who appeared perfectly healthy, but his skin was transparent like glass, and one could see the black blood flowing in his veins. He opened his eyes that had no pupils and were just two cavities full of dark galaxies. He reached his hand toward me and said, "Brother, why do you want to? In the game? We have just begun." At that moment, the house above my head completely collapsed. Tons of soil and wood fell onto the stone ceiling of the basement, but the stones did not budge. I was left alone with this small creature that seemed to be the embodiment of all the malice of this land. Elias, you understood that an axe could not kill him. He fed on hatred, and I was overflowing with hatred at that moment. The young boy crawled out from inside the cocoon. Wherever he stepped, the bones on the floor joined together to make a path for him. He approached me and placed his transparent hand on my cheek. The coldness of his hand was so great I felt my skin freeze. He gave a smile that stretched to his ears and said, "You are not the new owner, Elias. You are my new vessel." Elias. It was at that moment I understood that all my escapes, all those runs in the shifted hallways, had been just part of a game to exhaust my soul. The creature that stood before me in the shape of that boy with transparent skin was not taking his hand off my cheek. I felt the coldness of his being penetrating my cells like thousands of icy needles. He was not the homeowner. He was the house itself, which had now manifested in a small mold before me. The stone walls of the cave began to secrete the same sticky, purple substance. The bones on the floor set into motion and, like the pieces of a horrific puzzle, built a wall of skeletons all around us. The boy stared at me with those dark cavities of his eyes and said, "Where do you think your uncle went?" "He didn't leave. He only expanded. Now, it's your turn to break the boundaries of your body and join this territory." Suddenly, I felt my feet sinking into the hard stone. Not like sinking into mud, but as if the atoms of my body were merging with the atoms of the stone. The pain was indescribable, as if someone were scraping my bones piece by piece with a rasp to make them one with the basement foundation. "Elias," you screamed, but from your throat only the sound of vibrating stone came out. My larynx was becoming stony. The boy placed his other hand on my chest, right where my heart was beating. He whispered, "Your heart is beating too fast. This wastes too much energy. Let me divide this pulse for the whole building." With his every word, I felt my heartbeat slowing down, but in return, the cave walls began to shake with the same rhythm. I was being spread out. My hands were turning into branches of willow trees, and my skin was becoming the wallpapers of the upper floor, which were now buried under the rubble. In that moment when absolute despair had overcome me, my gaze fell on the rusty axe lying on the ground. But the axe was no longer a simple tool. The black blood that had splashed on it from the cocoon had caused the rusty metal to begin corroding, and from within it, an old, silver glow emerged. I remembered my aunt's words saying, "Go toward the burnt root." Burnt root means the place where the life of this creature has been cut off. With the last of the human strength remaining in my hands, I threw myself toward the axe. The boy gave a shriek that burst all the ceiling stones. He didn't want me to touch that axe. The rusty chains lunged at me again and grabbed my wrist, but I snatched the axe. Upon touching the axe, a current of real heat, the heat of the sun, ran through my veins. This axe was made of a tree that lightning had killed, a weapon of natural death against this unnatural life. I struck the axe with all my strength, not at the boy, but at the ground where my feet were stuck. As the axe hit the stone, a white, blinding light filled the entire space. A massive sound of breaking occurred, as if the bone of the entire earth had cracked. I was released. The boy was thrown back, and his body began to melt like glass kept in a fire. He was no longer smiling. His face changed form into thousands of weeping faces, the faces of my uncle, my aunt, and all those this house had. Swallowed. They were all shouting together, "Elias, end it. Set us free." I realized that hitting the boy was useless. He was just a reflection. I had to attack the main root, the cocoon that was now trying to repair itself again. I ran toward the cocoon with my glowing axe. Chains wrapped around my neck and blocked my airway. My eyes were bulging from their sockets. Everything was turning black, but I did not let go of the axe. With a circular motion, I drove the axe deep into the cocoon, right where the flow of black blood was thickest, and twisted it. An explosion of smoke and acid occurred. The entire basement began to destroy itself. But this time, the stones were not falling to bury me. They were being annihilated. The magical bond that kept this building upright was severed. The boy turned into a pile of ash with a pitiful moan. The chains unwound from around my neck, and I fell to the ground, filling my lungs with the dust-filled air. But Elias, the house did not surrender so easily. The collapsed building above my head began to spin. The rubble whirled around me like a tornado. The ground under my feet opened its mouth, but not to swallow, but to launch me out, like a body wanting to expel a poison. Amidst the darkness, rubble, and screams of the freed spirits, I was launched upward. When I opened my eyes, I was in the middle of the yard. It was morning. The sunlight hit my eyes mercilessly. I turned to see the house, but there was no house. Only a heap of burnt wood and broken stones that looked like they had caught fire 100 years ago. There was no longer any sign of that thumping. The ground was no longer hot. But when I looked at my hands, a shiver ran through my body. Under my skin, my veins still turned slightly purple. And worse than that, when I went toward the exit fence, I saw the same old neighbor looking at me in shock. He did not come forward. He only crossed himself and muttered, "You returned, but you didn't return alone." I looked back in horror. Amidst the ashes of the house, a pair of small, transparent footprints were seen on the ground, coming toward me. "Elias, you had destroyed the house, but it seemed you were still its owner. Or perhaps it was now your owner." Elias. At that moment when the sunlight shone on the cold ashes, I thought everything was finished. But those small, transparent footprints forming on the soft soil screamed a bitter truth in my ear. I had left the house, but the house had not left me. The old neighbor backed away with trembling steps and disappeared into the morning mist, as if seeing me was more ominous for him than seeing the house itself. I was left alone with a legacy that now flowed in my blood. I set off toward the road. With every step I took, I felt a strange heaviness in my bones. It was as if my skeleton was no longer just made of calcium, as if part of the steel beams and stones of that cursed structure remained in my being. When I reached the first small town and looked at myself in the mirror of a roadside cafe, I saw something that caused the glass of water to fall from my hand and shatter on the floor. The pupils of my eyes were no longer round. They looked like the same rectangular windows of the house, cold and soulless. I tried to return to a normal life. I rented a small apartment in the city, where I was surrounded by iron, concrete, and the sound of car horns. I thought the bustle of the city could silence those subdermal whispers. But on the first night, as I sat in the silence of my bedroom on the 4th floor, that horrific feeling returned. The floor of the room began to get hot, this time not because of the house, but because of my feet. Wherever I stepped, the laminate flooring began to vibrate. The walls no longer seemed like just walls to me. I could hear the flow of electricity in the heart of the wires, just like the sound of blood flow in veins. One night, when I placed my hand on the room wall out of nervous pressure, the wallpaper softened under my hand. "Elias, you watched in horror as the pattern of flowers on the wall of your rented room began to change and took the shape of those same purple and bruised flowers of the rural house. I was no longer a tenant. I was a seed. Wherever I went, I took that house with me to take root again. A month passed. My apartment no longer bore any resemblance to a modern residential unit. Doors would lock by themselves, and the downstairs neighbor complained that his house's ceiling constantly throbbed, and smelled of sour milk. I knew what was happening. That creature, that boy with transparent skin, had taken refuge in the depths of my mind. He whispered in my ear, "Elias, you cannot escape yourself. We need more space. We need more flesh." One morning, I found a letter under the house door. It had no stamp or address. I opened it. Inside was only an old photo, a photo of myself standing in the yard of that same rural house. But in the photo, I was smiling at the camera and had my hand on that same boy's shoulder. On the back of the photo was written, "Homeowners never die. They only multiply in new vessels." The pain in my bones became so great I could no longer stand. I crawled on the ground. I saw how the fingers of my hand began to lengthen and my nails became like rusty nails. My apartment began to expand. The small entrance hallway now seemed kilometers long. I was becoming the very thing I had run from. I was becoming a building. In the last moments when I could still call myself Elias, I went toward the window. The city sparkled beneath my feet. But I no longer saw the city. I only saw a network of structures that were thirsty for life. I understood that the rural house was only one of them. This whole world, all these cities, are built on hidden pulsations that feed on the flesh and blood of previous owners. My skin hardened and took the color of plaster. My eyes remained open forever to become windows that swallow light. My mouth locked to become a doorway that no one exits. Elias no longer existed. Now there was only a new space, an empty and hungry space waiting for the next heir. If one day on a remote road, or even in the bustle of the city, you see a house that seems too intimate, if you feel the walls getting hot with your touch, or if you hear a whisper calling your name, know that I am there. I am waiting behind every brick and after every layer of paint. I was Elias, but now I am the roof that stands above you. And remember, this house never keeps anyone. It only turns you into a part of itself. Now close the door, sit down, and let this pleasant warmth embrace your entire being. We have been waiting for you for a long time.